Guys, as always, I hope you're all doing great. Today we're going to talk about the Hooligan virus, the pathogen behind the events of Days Gone. In this video, we'll try to explain how this virus works from a pathophysiological perspective. We will examine the physiological changes that occur in the different types of infected, and then we will classify this pathogen according to the danger scale we use on this channel. But first, as usual, let's get some context. Days Gone is an excellent action-adventure video game with light survival and horror elements, best known for pitting the player against a massive hordes of infected, usually hundreds at once. In my opinion, it is still one of the best-looking games out there even today, arguably the pinnacle of what the Unreal Engine 4 can do, at least if we keep optimization in mind. Sadly, it was also a title that flew somewhat under the radar and that was significantly underrated by the so-called professional critics. This game's story unfolds in the rural regions of the state of Oregon, on the west coast of the United States, about 2 years after a virus of initially unknown origin spread across the globe. A pathogen that brought human civilization to the brink of extinction, not just because of its extremely high lethality, but also, and more importantly, because those who survived the infection turned into freakers. These are people mutated by the effects of the virus who literally gather into hordes of hyper-aggressive individuals who hunt and feed on animals, humans, and sometimes even other freakers. Interestingly, they can also feed on plants, which in my opinion makes them quite unique, something we will dive deeper into later. The pathogen responsible for all of this is known as the Hooligan virus or freaker virus, an infectious agent engineered in the labs of a company called Cloverdale. According to what's implied, it was designed as a vehicle to promote advantageous mutations in humans. In other words, it was a prototype for gene therapy. Despite this original intention, this virus can also infect a wide range of animals, including wolves, bears and crows, and even deer and bats based on certain dialogues. And although we are never explicitly told Hooligan virus's exact mechanisms of transmission or incubation period, we do know it is a highly contagious pathogen to the point of being able to trigger a global crisis of apocalyptic proportions within just 2 weeks of the initial case. This suggests it is probably an airborne microorganism with a relatively short incubation period, but beyond that, it is also an extremely lethal virus, almost 100% fatal for people under 12 or over 60 years old, and among those unlucky enough to survive, most end up turning into freakers. However, a small percentage of those affected develop immunity or become asymptomatic carriers, as is the case with the survivors we encounter. One thing that Days Gone does particularly well is the fact that it provides us with technical details about this virus's pathophysiology. One of the topics it touches on is viral tropism. Viruses don't typically attack all the cells in our body equally. On the contrary, they tend to favor certain types of cells or tissues, and this is what is known as a viral tropism. For example, there are neurotropic viruses, which target neurons specifically, and this would be the case with rabies. There are also hepatotropic viruses, which target liver cells, such as hepatitis B virus or yellow fever virus. In Days Gone, the developers did their homework, and this is something that is actually addressed. According to certain dialogues, Hooligan virus was engineered to primarily target not only the nervous system. Like many other prototypical zombie pathogens, it is a neurotropic virus, but in addition, it was also designed to attack the lymphatic system, making it a lymphotropic virus as well, something that makes a lot of sense and that is relatively common in real life. The lymphatic system is one of the most underrated components of our bodies. It functions as a drainage system for most of our tissues and plays a vital role in both digestive and immunity processes. Keep in mind that our blood doesn't just deliver oxygen and nutrients to our tissues, it also supplies them with fluids, water to hydrate our cells. The movement of liquids from the blood into the tissues leads to an accumulation of excess fluid over time, which can become problematic if it is not managed properly. This is where the lymphatic system comes in. It features specialized vessels that actively pump this excess fluid and return it into the bloodstream in the form of lymph. Every day, lymphatic vessels remove between 2 and 3 liters of fluid from our tissues, or around 70 to 100 ounces. And, as a side note, when this function fails, disorders like elephantiasis or lymphedema can occur. What's important here is that the lymphatic system must be directly connected with the rest of the circulatory system in order to return its high volume of fluids. And this happens mainly through a structure known as the thoracic duct, the biggest lymphatic vessel in humans, which drains the lymph from almost the entire body into the large veins of the neck. Thus, anything that enters the lymphatic circulation can easily make its way into the bloodstream as well, for example, a virus. To compound this, we have to take into account the fact that the lymphatic system is also highly exposed to invasion by all sorts of pathogens, whether through a wound in the skin or via the respiratory or digestive tract. When a pathogen gets deposited in one of our tissues, it almost inevitably ends up being drained into the lymphatic vessels. Now, this is not a bug, but rather a feature. The lymphatic system does far more than just collecting excess fluid. It also houses numerous defensive cells within different structures like the lymph nodes, for example. This allows the fast detection and elimination of pathogens, and among these defensive cells, lymphocytes stand out. These are essentially the elite troops of our immune system. Hooligan virus, as it is suggested, has the ability to infect these type of cells and uses the lymphatic system as both an incubator and a shortcut to the rest of the body. It moves from the lymph to the blood and from the blood to the brain. This is entirely realistic, and in fact, there are many real-life pathogens like Ebola virus or Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, that specifically target or exploit the lymphatic system and its cells to rapidly spread throughout the body. This ability is part of what allows these diseases to manifest and even cause death in just a matter of days. In contrast, rabies, the virus that is usually taken as the prototype or the basis for many of the zombie pathogens that exist in science fiction, mostly affects neurons and thus expands much more slowly through our bodies, to the point that it can take even years to incubate. So Hooligan virus's ability to affect and attack the lymphatic system would be quite consistent with the speed at which it's spread through the population. And guys, if you like this type of content, I would really appreciate if you could just hit that subscribe button, and maybe even leave a comment with ideas or suggestions for future videos. Back to the topic, once this pathogen reaches the brain, it likely triggers what is known as a viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain and the meninges, which are a set of protective membranes that surround the central nervous system. This is something that would explain much of what we can see among the freakers. Meningoencephalitis can cause symptoms such as photophobia, an aversion to light, which is clearly visible in how the infected actively seek out caves to hide during the day. It can also lead to impairments in gait, speech, coordination, and of course behavior, all of which we can also see in the victims. However, as Hooligan virus takes hold and time goes on, striking anatomical and physiological changes also begin to appear in those affected. The virus starts altering the genetic material of its victims, and once again, the game gives us some technical details about this. According to neuroagents, Hooligan virus is capable of manipulating the DNA in our cells to activate certain proto-oncogenes. These are genes linked to cancer. This is a concept grounded in real biology. In fact, there is an entire group of viruses known as oncogenic viruses that are capable of precisely doing what neuroscientists describe. These viruses can manipulate our DNA either directly or indirectly, triggering various types of cancer. Oncogenic literally means tumor-generating, and this is due to the fact that randomly altering a cell's DNA often leads to these kind of problems. Among oncogenic viruses, we have for example the Epstein-Barr virus, which not only causes mononucleosis, but it is also linked to the Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of blood or hematological cancer. Other examples include certain strains of the human papillomavirus, which are associated with cervical cancer, and of course the hepatitis C and B viruses, which are linked to liver cancer. As we mentioned, these type of viruses alter our DNA through two main mechanisms. The first is indirect action, which involves damaging the systems our cells use to repair or replicate their genetic material. This leads to mutations and thus to cancer. The second type of mechanism, direct action, involves the integration of viral DNA directly into the genome of our cells. Oncogenic viruses that operate through this direct mechanism can leave their genes inside a cell's nucleus even after the infection is, let's say, cured, allowing those genes to persist over time. When the affected cell divides, its daughter cells inherit these viral genes as well, even if they were never infected directly in the first place. This is the reason behind the fact that a significant portion of human DNA is actually made up of remnants of ancient viruses that left their genetic material in the DNA of our ancestors. These are the so-called endogenous retroviruses. And based on the dialogues in Days Gone, Hooligan Virus may operate through this exact mechanism. It was designed in a lab not so much to behave like a disease, but rather to serve as a vector for inserting specific genes into the human population. What Cloverdale, the institution where the virus was developed, perhaps didn't account for was that a probably unstable prototype of this pathogen would end up leaking out of the facility. This led not only to the collapse of human civilization, but also to the emergence of several subspecies of modified humans, the result of new genes being inserted into their cells. First, among these new human subspecies, or freakers as they are called, we have Homo sapiens mutans turba. Putting aside the rather loose use of binomial nomenclature, they are best known as swarmers. They are characterized by loss of skin pigmentation, total alopecia in males and alopecia areata in females. But above all, they exhibit strength and endurance far beyond those a normal human, especially considering the typically thin build of these infected individuals. However, what makes them truly dangerous isn't just their individual traits, it is their ability to communicate using pheromones. This allows them to gather in large groups and to mark feeding zones such as mass graves and cemeteries, as well as sources of water. These abilities are attributed to the production of several types of pheromones which, as we are told, are excreted along the feces. Now, the term pheromone is probably one of the most misused and misunderstood in biological sciences. It is often treated as a synonym for aphrodisiac or simply a strong odor, but in reality this concept refers to substances that function like a hormone but in an organism different from the one that synthesized them in the first place. In other words, they are hormones produced in one individual meant to act on another. The word itself tells us as much. Pheromone comes from the Greek phoroi, meaning to bear, like in sarissa phoroi, which would mean spear bearer. This combined with the word hormone, so a substance that bears a hormone, or rather a hormonal function. We humans don't have any proven pheromones of our own, at least none that science has definitively confirmed. It is not that there isn't any evidence, but rather that the evidence that we have is insufficient. However, we do have a vestigial organ associated with pheromone detection, the vomeronasal organ, which even has its own dedicated cranial nerve, the terminal nerve or cranial nerve 0. These are structures that degenerate during fetal development and serve no confirmed function in adults, but they could potentially be repurposed by the virus as a basis for the pheromone-based communication we can see in freakers. Now, with this explained, what may seem a little odd at first is that the infected use their excrement as a vehicle for this form of communication. However, this is actually quite consistent with human physiology. Among all the hormones produced by our bodies, the ones with the most theoretical potential to behave like pheromones are steroid hormones. Those derive from cholesterol such as testosterone, estradiol, and cortisol. Cholesterol isn't just a form of fat that clogs your arteries, it is also the foundation for the synthesis of some of the most important hormones in the human body. And one of the primary routes through which both cholesterol and these hormones are eliminated is through the bile, which ultimately ends up in the feces. In fact, the word cholesterol literally means vile esterol. Chole is Greek for vile, which gives us related words such as melancholy, which literally means black bile, a callback to those times when mood was related to different bodily fluids, or rather humors, but I digress. The point that I'm making is that a significant portion of bile, along with the steroid hormones it carries, ends up in feces, and these hormones or modified versions of them could potentially act as pheromones in the case of freakers. So the fact that the infected in Days Gone can communicate and even mark areas of interest through their excrements is actually quite biologically plausible. Now moving on to the first type of special infected, we have Homo sapiens mutans corporosus, also known as breakers. According to in-game explanations, this type of infected results from a person who used anabolic androgenic steroids before the infection. Now, this particular explanation is rather weak in my opinion. Keep in mind that the use of anabolic androgenic steroids sourced from outside our own bodies actually leads to the incapacity to produce them naturally, at least in a temporary manner. The use of external testosterone or its analogs shuts down the body's own production, and in males it eventually leads to testicular atrophy. And all of this would, at least initially, be incompatible with what we can see among the breakers, as I doubt they are still injecting themselves 2 years after the apocalypse. It's much more plausible that these are individuals whose endocrine systems have been affected by the virus, leading to a natural but exaggerated production of physiological anabolic steroids such as the already mentioned testosterone. This aside, it is also mentioned that this class of infected can arise from people who have naturally higher levels of this hormone, so there might be some genetic predisposition behind these cases. Additionally, some neuroagents tell us that the Hooligan virus can enhance muscle strength through non-hormonal mechanisms as well. Specifically, we are told that the virus induces an increase in muscle striations, something that actually makes a lot of sense. Muscle tissue can be divided into two main groups: smooth muscle, which is found in our internal organs and blood vessels, and striated muscle, which includes both cardiac muscle and the skeletal muscle we use to move and control our bodies. The term striated muscle refers to the visible stripes or bands present in this kind of tissue when seen under optical microscopes. These bands come from the highly organized arrangement of proteins into structures called sarcomeres, and the different bands we can observe under the microscope roughly correspond to the starting and ending points of these sarcomeres. Each sarcomere is a functional unit capable of contraction, and collectively they give each muscle cell its contractile power. In the case of freakers, an increase in muscle striations suggests they have higher numbers of sarcomeres, possibly packed more densely within their muscle cells. This implies that freakers have not only more powerful muscles, but also stronger hearts, since this organ is also composed of striated muscle. This could explain not only their strength and speed, but also their endurance when running. Another type of infected that might be explained through similar mechanisms to those found in the breaker is the reacher, who, although not as resilient, is significantly faster and sometimes even erratic. The presence of a clear hypertrichosis and excess of body hair could also be attributed to anabolic androgenic steroids, particularly compounds like dihydrotestosterone, which, when combined with certain genetic profiles, can result in distinctive patterns of hair growth. It is also likely that other endocrine substances play a role in the case of reachers, perhaps adrenaline or even thyroid hormones, which are capable of significantly accelerating the metabolism of our cells, and in excess, they can lead to a condition known as akathisia, in which a person is simply incapable of staying still. This excessive energy expenditure in the case of reachers would make them unable to reach the high levels of muscle mass we can see in breakers. Moving on to less imposing types of infected, we have Homo sapiens mutans adolescens, better known as newts. These are prepubescent humans infected with the Hooligan virus who, against all odds, survived the initial infection. Newts show many of the same changes we can see in adult freakers: partial or complete alopecia, varicose veins, the pigmentation of the skin, and an ability to communicate or at least gather alongside others of their kind. They are opportunistic predators and scavengers that prefer high places like rooftops or dark secluded locations like mines, likely in an effort to avoid other more dangerous infected subspecies because they, in fact, are often hunted by other types of infected. And finally, we have the Screamer, a female variant with albinism known for a powerful shriek capable of attracting other infected from dozens of meters around. This ability, as we are told, is the result of a modification in the structure of the larynx. Broadly speaking, many of the changes seen in these infected individuals can be explained through alterations in the secretion of steroid hormones, either to function as pheromones or to produce anatomical modifications. This provides a simple but effective explanation, especially considering that the secretion of these hormones is regulated by the central nervous system, which, as we mentioned, is directly targeted by the virus. It is an explanation that could also apply to some extent to the various animal species that can be infected by the virus. Now, regarding the loss of skin pigmentation, two hypotheses come to mind. The first is an autoimmune reaction. The viral infection might induce an abnormal immune behavior, causing the immune system to attack both the hair follicles, resulting in hair loss, and the melanocytes, the cells responsible for skin and hair coloration. Alternatively, the loss of skin pigmentation could also be explained through the inhibition of melanotropins, a group of hormones that regulate melanocyte activity. Interestingly, melanotropin production is closely linked to the production of certain steroid hormones as well, specifically cortisol. Cortisol is the paramount stress hormone. Changes in temperature, for example, can induce physiological stress, which at the same time can lead to modifications in cortisol secretion, which are attached to changes in pigmentation. This is the mechanism behind the changes in fur color we can see in Arctic foxes and rabbits that is linked to temperature and seasons. In humans, this is something that is only partially present, but present nonetheless. Addison syndrome, a disease which occurs with an abnormally low production of cortisol, is characterized by the darkening of the skin, showing how these two things go hand in hand, although the mechanisms are beyond the scope of this video. But setting all the different kinds of special infected aside, what truly makes the Hooligan virus dangerous is its capacity to create subspecies out of infected individuals. This is important because labeling a population as a subspecies, as neuroofficials do, implies that it has the capacity to reproduce and sustain itself over time. Or maybe the folks at Nero just wanted to sound smart by using Latin, which would be completely understandable actually. Still, unlike the zombies or infected in other science fiction works, freakers do carry out basic life functions. They sleep, drink water, and eat. This means they won't simply rot away and die over time. What's worse, the virus has granted them the ability to digest new food sources such as cellulose, the same substance found in paper, cardboard, and more generally a large part of all plant life. Even though humans cannot digest or break down cellulose, this substance is ultimately composed of glucose molecules linked together. And glucose, as you might know, is the main source of energy for all of our cells. So not only are freakers not going to disappear, it is actually more likely that humans will be the ones starving out in the long run. And if that wasn't enough, we also have to consider the emergence of intelligent freakers, those who seem to be gradually regaining their cognitive abilities. This is something that appears to happen in stages, but it is not clearly elaborated by neuroscientists. For all of these reasons, I believe the Hooligan virus from Days Gone is one of the most dangerous zombie viruses of all, maybe even more dangerous than the Haram virus we already examined, capable of driving human species to extinction not only through civilizational collapse, famine, or disease, but also, and perhaps more critically, through competition with a new generation of mutated human beings, stronger and as intelligent, if not more, than a regular person. And it is for all these reasons that the Hooligan virus gets an 8 out of 10 in our danger scale. We might even say an 8.5 out of 10. Guys, remember to fit the algorithm with a comment. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe. Big thanks to everyone who made it this far, and I'll see you all in the next video.